Welcome to Damon Revenge Stories. Get ready for tales of sweet revenge.
My name is Joel Costello. I'm 40 years old. On a Wednesday evening last month, my mother called my phone for the 11th time that day, and I watched her name pulse on the screen while my daughter tugged my sleeve and said, "Dad, chapter 6. I pressed decline with my thumb. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel guilt. I felt the specific weight of a man sitting in a home that is his, reading a book to a child who is safe, while the person who told the world he had no spine listens to his voicemail greeting for the 11th time. 3 months before that Wednesday, I walked into my parents' office on a Monday morning and handed my mother a single sheet of paper. She read the words, "effective 90 days ago," and her face lost every shade of color it had ever carried. My father picked up the phone to call their attorney and heard a disconnected number. I already knew which firm he'd call. I'd known for months. But to explain how a man dismantles 14 years of his own entrapment from the inside without anyone hearing the locks click, I have to take you back to the beginning. Welcome back to this channel. This is where we tell stories about people who stayed too long in situations that should have broken them, and who found a way out that nobody saw coming. If you've ever built something with your hands and watched someone else collect the reward, this one is going to sit in your chest. Hit subscribe, drop a comment if you've been there, and stay with me because what Joel did over 90 days in silence is one of the most precisely engineered exits I've ever had the privilege of telling. To understand how that Monday morning happened, you have to understand the 14 years that came before it. You have to understand what it costs to build a kingdom for someone else and call it family. I grew up in Doylestown, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. My father, Gene Costello, started Costello Commercial Landscaping in 1996 with a used Ford F-250, a trailer with a rusted hitch, and 6 commercial accounts he got by knocking on the back doors of office parks in his church clothes. My mother, Linda, handled the books. She was good at it. She had a way of making numbers behave, of knowing which invoices to push and which to hold. And she kept that company alive through 2 recessions by sheer force of accounting will. I respected that. I want you to understand that I respected both of them. I'm not telling you a story about monsters. I'm telling you a story about people who loved the structure of a family business more than they loved the family member who built it. I joined Costello Commercial Landscaping at 26. I'd been working construction since I was 19, running small crews, learning irrigation systems, understanding the chemistry of commercial turf management. My father asked me to come aboard because they had 6 accounts and needed someone who could handle the physical operations while he focused on client relationships. That was the word he used. Relationships. What he meant was golf. What he meant was the Rotary Club. What he meant was the part of the business that felt like status rather than labor. And that was fine with me because I liked the work. I liked the feel of a property transformed, the geometry of a well-edged commercial lot, the satisfaction of 47 sprinkler heads running in synchronized zones at 5 in the morning. Year 1. My father shook my hand across the kitchen table and said, "Give us a year, prove yourself, and we'll put you in for 25%. I was 26. I believed in handshakes. I believed my father's hand meant the same thing mine did. I signed nothing. That handshake was the most expensive contract I never executed. By year 4, I had grown the client list from 6 accounts to 31. I'd hired and trained 3 full crews. I'd negotiated a fleet lease for 4 trucks through a dealership in Warminster, where the sales manager owed me a favor from a drainage project I'd done on his property. The business was grossing $400,000. My parents paid themselves $85,000 each. I made $38,000. When I raised the equity question, my father said, "When your mother retires, we'll do the full transfer. Just give it time." My mother was 54. She showed no signs of retiring. She showed signs of remodeling the kitchen. Here is what the trap looked like from the inside. The LLC registration was in my parents' names. The bonding certificate, which you need in Pennsylvania to perform commercial landscape work over a certain dollar value, was issued to Costello Commercial Landscaping, LLC, my parents' entity. Every truck was titled in the company's name. My health insurance ran through the company. My daughter was born in year 5, and her pediatrician was covered by that policy. My rented duplex, 4 miles from my parents' property, was affordable only because I wasn't carrying a vehicle payment. I drove a company truck, titled in their name, with their insurance. If I walked away from transportation, from health coverage, from the only professional identity I'd built in a decade. Every year I stayed, the web got tighter. Not because they were locking doors, because every thread of my practical life ran through their name. By year 7, the business grossed $800,000. I managed 53 accounts, 7 crews, a maintenance schedule that ran like a transit system. I asked for the partnership paperwork directly. I sat in my father's home office, the one with the mahogany desk. I'm here for that. Bought with revenue I generated. And I said, "Yeda ma, Dad, I need the paperwork. I need my name on this." He rubbed his jaw. He looked at the wall. "After tax season," he said, let's get through April, and we'll sit down with the attorney." April passed. May passed. I raised it again in June, and he said, "Your mother's not ready." And I understood that "not ready" was a gate that had no opening mechanism. It was a phrase designed to sound temporary, while being permanent. Year 9. My younger brother Kevin, who had never worked a day in commercial landscaping, who had spent his 20s managing a gym in Newtown, received $140,000 from my parents to open a CrossFit franchise. I learned this at Thanksgiving. My mother mentioned it between the turkey and the pie, as though it were weather. Kevin got $140,000 in startup capital. I got a $2 an hour raise that year, pushing me to $42,000. The business grossed $900,000. My parents each drew $150,000. I sat at that Thanksgiving table and did the arithmetic in my head, while my daughter ate cranberry sauce with her fingers. And the arithmetic tasted like something rusted and metallic at the back of my throat. But I stayed. I want you to understand why I stayed. Because it matters. It matters because the people who say, "just leave," have never had their child's health insurance threaded through someone else's signature. I stayed because I had a daughter. Because I had a crew of 22 men and women who depended on roots I'd built. Because every professional relationship in the industry knew me as Costello Commercial. Because starting over at 35 with no equipment, no bonding, and no client list of my own felt like jumping off a bridge and hoping there was water below. The trap was not a locked room. The trap was 1,000 threads, each one thin enough to break individually, each one connected to something I couldn't afford to lose. Year 11. I found out my health insurance had been downgraded. Not from my parents, from a pharmacy. My daughter needed a prescription, and the pharmacist told me my coverage had changed. I called the insurance company. They confirmed. The policy had been switched from a PPO to a high deductible plan 4 months earlier. The savings to the company was $380 a month. My parents kept the premium plan for themselves. They didn't tell me. They saved $4,560 a year by downgrading my daughter's coverage and said nothing. That night, I sat in the parking lot of the CVS in Doylestown, and my hands shook on the steering wheel. Not from anger, from the recognition of what I was to them. A cost center, a line item, an employee they happened to share DNA with. My body knew before my mind accepted it. Every Sunday night, my hands would start shaking around 8 o'clock. A low tremor, almost invisible, running from my wrists to my fingertips. My wife, Danielle, noticed before I did. She'd put her hand over mine during dinner and press down gently, not saying anything, just applying counter pressure to the shaking. Monday mornings I'd pull into the equipment yard at 5:30, and the knot between my shoulder blades would tighten like someone was turning a wrench. 14 years of that wrench. 14 years of arriving at a property I built and seeing their name on the sign. Year 13. My parents hired Kevin's wife, Rachel, as the office manager. Salary, $65,000. She worked 12 hours per week. She filed invoices, answered some calls, and organized the tax folders once a quarter. $65,000. I was making $52,000. I was managing 94 accounts, coordinating 11 crews, handling every client escalation, every weather contingency, every equipment failure at 3 a.m. Rachel made more than me for 12 hours of filing per week. When I brought this up, my father said the words that would become the guillotine. He didn't say them to me. He said them to my mother on a voicemail that Kevin accidentally forwarded to the family group chat instead of to his wife. My mother's voice, clear as church bells, said, "He's not going to do anything. He doesn't have the spine, Linda. He never has." She was talking to Aunt Diane. She was talking about me. She was talking about the son who built her business from 6 accounts to 94. And she was laughing. Not cruel laughter. Worse. Comfortable laughter. The laughter of someone so certain of another person's captivity that the idea of escape is entertainment. I listened to that voicemail 17 times. Not because I was wounded. I was past wounded. I listened because I was memorizing. I was mapping the architecture of their certainty. They were sure I wouldn't leave because they held the LLC. They held the bonding. They held the truck titles and the insurance and the professional identity. They held every structural element and believed that structure was the same as loyalty. What they forgot, what they never bothered to learn, was that I was the one who knew how all of it worked. I knew which surety company issued the bond. I knew which state board processed the contractor license. I knew which forms to file, which timelines applied, which clerk's office processed the DBA registrations in Bucks County. They held the paperwork. I held the knowledge of how paperwork is made. That voicemail landed on my phone on a Thursday in October. I listened to it in the cab of the company truck, parked outside my daughter's school, waiting for the 3:15 bell. The engine was off. The heater ticked as it cooled. My daughter came out in her purple coat, backpack, bouncing, and I realized that the shaking in my hands had stopped. For the first time in years, my hands were completely still. Not calm. Decided. There's a difference between a man who is at peace and a man who has chosen his war. My hands were still because every part of me had aligned behind a single objective. I was going to take back what I built, and I was going to do it so quietly that they wouldn't hear the foundation shift until the building was already gone. What I found in Kevin's sent folder, the accidentally forwarded voicemail, changed the math permanently. But it wasn't the only thing that changed. 2 months later, Christmas dinner. The whole family around my parents' dining room table. Kevin and Rachel, Aunt Diane, Danielle and my daughter. My parents holding court like always. Rachel was sitting across from me, and between the ham and the green beans, she asked me a question. "Joel, how does commercial bonding work? Like, can anyone get bonded? Or does it have to be the company?" The table didn't notice. Conversation continued around us, but I looked at Rachel, and she held my eyes for a beat too long, and something in her expression wasn't curiosity. It was reconnaissance. 3 weeks later, I would understand why she asked about the surety bond at Christmas. The plan began the first week of January. I set myself a calendar, 90 days. March was the month my parents planned to list the business with Aunt Diane's commercial broker. I had to complete my separation before they could complete their sale. The ticking clock was not abstract. It was March 1st. And every day I didn't act was a day closer to discovering that the business I built had been sold out from under me. Day 1. I drove to the Bucks County Recorder of Deeds office in Doylestown during my lunch break. I filed a DBA registration, Joel Costello Landscape, LLC. The clerk processed it while I ate a turkey sandwich in the waiting area. My hands were steady. The form cost $40. It took 11 minutes. In 11 minutes, I existed as a legal entity independent of my parents for the first time in 14 Years. That night I sat at my kitchen table after my daughter went to bed and wrote a list on a legal pad. Not what I wanted, what I needed. Bonding, contractor license, client contracts, equipment leases, a business bank account, route maps, crew contacts, insurance. Each item was a scene I would have to stage and execute without my parents noticing. I was living inside their operation 12 hours a day. Every phone call could be overheard. Every absence would be noticed. I had to build a company inside their company the way you'd build a room inside a house. Same walls, same roof, but with a door only I knew existed. Week 2. The bonding. In Pennsylvania, commercial landscape work over a threshold requires a surety bond. My parents' bond was through a surety company in Philadelphia that they'd used for 11 years. I couldn't use the same company without triggering a flag. I researched competing surety firms, found one in King of Prussia, and drove there on a Saturday morning while Danielle took our daughter to swim lessons. The bond officer reviewed my financials. I showed him the DBA, my 14 years of operational history. Client references from accounts that knew me by first name. He approved a preliminary bond in 40 minutes. I drove home with the paperwork in a manila envelope under my spare jacket in the back seat. That envelope lived in the bottom drawer of my toolbox in the garage, under a tray of socket wrenches. For 90 days, the most important documents of my life sat beneath oily ratchets in a red metal box. My parents had never touched a toolbox in their lives. It was the safest vault I had. Week 3. The almost caught. I was doing laundry, a Sunday, nothing unusual, and Danielle called upstairs that my father was at the door. My father never came to my duplex unannounced. I heard his voice in the kitchen, and I realized that my new business cards, Joel Costello Landscape LLC, with my cell number and a P.O. box I'd rented in Warminster, were sitting on top of the dryer. I had picked them up from the print shop the day before and left them in my jacket, which I'd thrown in the wash pile. I came downstairs and my father was standing in the kitchen holding a business card. "What's this?" he said, turning it between his fingers. My heart rate hit 150. I felt it in my teeth. I heard myself say, "Side project for a friend. Guy I know from church wants to start a small lawn service. Asked me to help him set up." My father looked at the card for another 3 seconds. 3 seconds where the entire architecture of my escape existed in the space between his thumb and forefinger. Then he set it on the counter. "Don't let it distract you from the real work," he said. He came by to tell me about a drainage complaint at one of our commercial properties. We talked about grading for 10 minutes. He left. I locked the front door, walked to the bathroom, and threw up. Then I washed my face, dried my hands, and moved the business cards to the toolbox. Week 4 through 6. The license transfer. This was the most complex piece. Pennsylvania's contractor board processes license applications and transfers on a timeline that can't be rushed. I submitted my application on a Tuesday morning from a FedEx store in Lansdale. 20 miles from Doylestown, where no one I knew would see me. Using my new DBA, my bonding certificate, and my personal qualifications. The state board estimated processing at 45 to 60 days. I needed it done in under 70. I called the board office every Friday from my truck, parked in a grocery store lot, to check the status. Every call was a moment of exposure. If anyone checked my phone records, they'd see repeated calls to the state contractor board. But my parents didn't check my phone. They checked my work. They checked my hours. They never thought to check the administrative machinery that made their company legal, because they had never understood it. That was my job. That had always been my job. Week 6, Rachel. She drove to my duplex at 9 on a Tuesday night. Danielle answered the door. Rachel stood on my porch holding a manila folder, and she did not sit down when she came inside. She set the folder on my kitchen table and said 5 words. "They're going to sell it." Inside the folder, the commercial broker's valuation draft, the timeline for listing, correspondence between my father's attorney and the broker, and a memo outlining how the sale proceeds would be split. 60% to my parents, 40% to Kevin for his second CrossFit location. My name appeared nowhere. 14 years of my work, 94 accounts of my building, and in the distribution memo, I did not exist. Rachel set the folder on my kitchen table and did not sit down. She stood with her coat still on, arms crossed, and said, "They're doing the same thing to me. I'm the next one they'll cut out when I'm not useful." She was right. Rachel worked 12 hours a week for $65,000. But that salary was a leash, not a gift. It kept her inside the building where she could see the books, and it made Kevin feel like the family was taking care of his wife. When the business sold, Rachel's position would evaporate. Kevin would get his 40%, and Rachel would get whatever Kevin decided she deserved. She knew the math. She knew it the way I knew it, not in theory, but in the body, in the tightness behind the ribs. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Time," I said. "And the tax files from the last 3 years?" She brought them 2 days later in the same folder during her lunch hour. I photographed every page with my phone and returned the originals before the end of the workday. 3 years of financial records showing the revenue I generated, the payments my parents took, and the trajectory of a business built on my labor and titled in their names. Weeks 7 through 10. The clients. This was the most dangerous phase. I had 94 commercial accounts, each one maintained by crews I'd hired and trained, using routes I'd designed and equipment I'd sourced. The clients knew me. Most of them had never met my parents. When I visited their properties, which I did weekly as part of quality control, I was Joel, the guy who showed up personally after every storm, who adjusted their irrigation schedules by hand, who remembered the name of the office manager's dog. I couldn't contact 94 clients simultaneously without triggering an alarm. I couldn't send a mass communication. I had to reach each one individually during normal service visits and have a conversation that sounded like a routine update, but planted a seed. We're restructuring some of our service operations this spring. I want to make sure your property stays with our A team. I said versions of this to every client over a 3-week period. Not one of them called my parents to verify. Not one. Because they didn't have a relationship with my parents. They had a relationship with me. The villain charm offensive hit in week 9. My mother invited Danielle and me for Sunday dinner. Not a holiday, not a birthday, just dinner. She made pot roast, my favorite. She asked about my daughter's school. She complimented Danielle's hair. She told a story about my father and me fishing when I was 12. And she laughed with a warmth that sounded so genuine, I felt the ground shift under my plan. I sat at that table eating pot roast and thinking, maybe they'll change. Maybe if I just talk to them directly, show them the numbers, appeal to the thing that is supposed to exist between parents and children. Maybe. Then my father said, "Kevin's gym is doing great. Second location by summer." And my mother said, "He's got Gene's head for business." And I looked at my plate and saw the pot roast for what it was. Not a reconciliation, but a maintenance visit. They were servicing me the way I serviced a commercial property. Just enough attention to prevent the client from looking elsewhere. The warmth was weather, not climate. The pattern was intact. It had always been intact. Week 11. The equipment leases. This was the kill shot and the most technically complex maneuver. Costello Commercial's fleet. 7 trucks, 3 trailer rigs, 2 skid steers, and the industrial mowers was leased through a dealership in Warminster. The leases were in the company's name. But I had personally negotiated every one of them. The dealership's fleet manager, a man named Jerry Tomczak, knew me by handshake. He'd never met my parents. I drove to Warminster on a Saturday and sat with Jerry in his office and explained the restructuring. I showed him the DBA, the bonding, the pending contractor license. I asked him to transfer the leases to Joel Costello Landscape LLC. Jerry looked at the paperwork for 5 minutes. Then he said, "Joel, you've been the only person who's ever walked through my door for this account. As far as I'm concerned, you are the account." The lease transfer is processed in 8 business days. For 8 days, I went to work at my parents' company, drove their trucks, managed their crews, and smiled at their name on the building while every piece of equipment in their yard was legally migrating to mine. I felt like a man standing on a bridge that was dissolving behind him, walking forward at exactly the speed of the collapse. If they checked the lease agreements, which they never did, because my mother handled the money and my father handled the golf, the whole thing would surface. 8 days of walking that bridge with the key on my carabiner bouncing against my hip. The same carabiner my father gave me on day 1, the weight of it no longer a symbol of belonging, but a countdown to departure. The last week, the state contractor license came through on a Thursday. I opened the envelope in the parking lot of the Warminster post office, and for 30 seconds, I just held it. A piece of paper with my name on it, authorizing me to do commercially what I'd been doing for 14 years, under someone else's authorization. My hands did not shake. My vision did not blur. I felt something more specific than relief. I felt the sensation of structural integrity, like a building that had been leaning for years suddenly finding its true vertical. That Thursday night, I sat in my daughter's room while she slept and looked at the carabiner on my keyring. Silver, scratched, 16 years old. My father had given it to me with the company truck key clipped to it on my first day. "Don't lose this," he'd said. I hadn't. I'd carried it every day for 14 years. The key opened every gate, every storage unit, every padlock in the Costello commercial operation. After Monday, it would open nothing of mine. I unclipped it from my keyring and held it in my palm. It weighed almost nothing. It had weighed everything. The night before, Saturday, Danielle was asleep. My daughter was asleep. I lay in bed and listened to the house, the refrigerator humming, a car passing on the street, the specific silence of a home at midnight where everyone you love is breathing safely in their rooms. I was not afraid. I'd been afraid for 90 days, and now the fear had been burned out of me by preparation. What I felt was the strange, suspended state of standing at the edge of a permanent change. Like the moment before jumping into water. You can see the surface. You know it will hold you, but your body hasn't felt it yet. I ran through the sequence one more time. Monday, 5 a.m. No arrival at the equipment yard. Monday, 6 a.m. The 11 commercial crews, all 26 employees, would receive the communication I'd drafted and scheduled. New company name, same crews, same routes, same Joel. Monday morning, 94 clients would receive a letter on Joel Costello Landscape LLC letterhead, informing them of the new service structure. Monday, whenever my parents arrived at the yard, they would find a locked gate and 0 operational vehicles. I had not told Danielle the timing until that Saturday afternoon. I told her the plan weeks earlier. She'd known about the DBA, the bonding, the license. She was the one who'd caught the voicemail. She was the one whose hands stopped my shaking every Sunday night. When I told her Monday was the day, she looked at me for a long time, then said, "I'll have the overnight bags in the car." Not because we were running, because she understood that the first 72 hours would be volatile, and she wanted options. Sunday, I went to church with my family. I sat in the pew and listened to a sermon about provision, and I thought about the word provide, and how my parents had weaponized it. How the seer tier or Seer John Seorvaris Spo Humpais Rome job that was actually a cage, how they provided a promise that was actually a leash, how they provided a family name that was actually a brand on my labor. After church, my mother hugged me in the parking lot and said, "See you tomorrow morning." I said, "See you tomorrow." I meant it differently than she heard it. Monday morning. March 3rd, 5 a.m. I did not drive to the equipment yard. I stood in my kitchen in the dark, coffee in my hand, and watched the clock on the microwave change from 4:59 to 5. The green digits blinked once and held. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the baseboard heater expanding in the wall. At that moment, the scheduled emails released. 26 crew members received new employment agreements under Joel Costello Landscape LLC. Same pay, same routes, same schedules, better insurance. I'd secured a group plan through the new entity that restored the PPO coverage my parents had stripped. Every crew member accepted. Every single one. Not because I'd bribed them or pressured them. Because for 14 years, I was the one who showed up at 3 a.m. during ice storms. I was the one who remembered their kids' names and adjusted their schedules for custody weekends. I was the one who managed their daily reality. My parents were names on a sign they'd never stood under in the rain. I set my coffee mug on the counter and listened to the sounds of the morning outside. A cardinal on the telephone wire, the neighbor's garage door rolling up, ordinary sounds on a day that was not ordinary. My phone began to vibrate at 5:14, the first crew member responding, a woman named Angela who ran my northeast route. Her reply was 2 words. Finally, Joel. I read that on my screen in the dark kitchen and my throat closed for a moment. 14 years of silence, and the people who worked beside me had been watching the whole time. At 7 a.m., the letters arrived. 94 commercial clients received notification of the service restructuring. 83 of them would sign with Joel Costello Landscape LLC within the week. The other 11 signed within 2 weeks. Every single account, not a legal maneuver. Shakum. A relational, frugal one. The clients chose the person who'd maintain their properties, not the name on the contract they'd never met. At 7:15, I drove to my parents' property. Not to the equipment yard, to the office. I wore clean clothes. I carried a single sheet of paper. The parking lot had 2 cars in it, my mother's silver Lexus and my father's black Tahoe, both purchased with revenue I generated. The yard behind the office was visible through the window, and I could see it clearly. Empty. No trucks, no trailers, no mowers. Just the gravel lot with oil stains where the fleet used to park, and a chain link fence with nothing behind it. The fleet had been relocated to a leased lot in Warminster over the previous 2 weekends, during hours my parents never worked, by crew members who showed up because I asked them to. I stood in that parking lot for 15 seconds before I went inside. The air smelled like diesel residue and cold gravel. A wind gust caught a loose piece of paper against the fence. An old route schedule, weeks outdated, and pinned it there. The building looked smaller without the trucks. I had never noticed how small it was. My mother was at her desk. My father was pouring coffee. The fluorescent light above my mother's desk buzzed the way it always did. A faint, high-pitched whine that I'd listened to for 14 years and never mentioned. They looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, it was just Monday. Just Joel arriving for work. My mother had her reading glasses on. My father held his coffee mug, the one that said, "World's Best Boss." A gift from Kevin 3 Christmases ago. Then I set the paper on my mother's desk. "What is this?" she said. Her voice was still casual. She hadn't looked down yet. "Read it." She read it. I watched her eyes track across the lines. The DBA registration number, the bonding certificate reference, the state contractor license number, the effective date. Her reading glasses slid down her nose and she did not push them back. Effective 90 days ago. Her face lost color in 4 seconds. I counted, not out of cruelty, out of precision. I had spent 14 years watching her count my value in dollars, and in that moment, I was counting her comprehension in seconds. The blood left her cheeks first, then her lips, then the skin around her eyes, until she looked like a woman standing in a room that had suddenly lost its heat. My father set the coffee mug down. The ceramic base hit the counter harder than he intended. A sharp sound that cracked through the office like a stone dropped on tile. He picked up the phone. His hand was moving on instinct. Call the attorney. Fix the problem. Make the sun fall back in line. He dialed. His index finger punched the numbers from memory, the same sequence he'd dialed for 15 years. The automated message played, "The number you have reached has been disconnected." He stared at the phone. The dial tone returned. He pressed the numbers again, slower this time, as though speed had been the error, the same recording. He held the receiver away from his ear and looked at it, and I saw something I had never seen on my father's face in 40 years. Bewilderment. Not anger. Not strategy. The raw confusion of a man whose reflexes had failed him. I hadn't disconnected their attorney. I'd simply known which firm they'd call. Brennan and Associates, the only firm they'd ever used. And I'd known that Brennan was 3 weeks into a planned office relocation that involved temporary number changes. I'd timed the Monday to coincide with the week their attorney's old number would be inactive, and their new number wouldn't yet be listed. A 72-hour window of silence. Enough time for the reality to harden before legal counsel could offer false hope. "Joel," my father said. His voice came out lower than usual, pressed flat by the weight of what he was beginning to understand. "What did you do?" It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man looking at an empty yard through a window and understanding for the first time that the thing he thought he owned had legs and a will, and a plan he never saw coming. His jaw worked once, twice, the way it did when he was calculating. But there was nothing left to calculate. I said nothing. I took the carabiner from my pocket, the one he'd given me 16 years ago, scratched silver, the company truck key still clipped to it, and I set it on my mother's desk next to the letter. The metal made a small sound against the wood. A click, barely audible, that settled into the silence like a period at the end of a sentence. No note, no speech, no confrontation. I'd spent 14 years talking to these people, explaining, requesting, hoping. The silence was the loudest thing I'd ever said. My mother's reading glasses slid off her face entirely and landed on the desk. She didn't reach for them. Her mouth opened and closed twice before she spoke. The fluorescent light above her buzzed into the gap. "You can't do this. This is our company." Her voice broke on the word, "our." Not with grief, but with the strain of holding a claim. She could feel dissolving in her own mouth. "It was your LLC," I said. "It was my company. It has been for 14 years. The difference is that now the paperwork matches the reality." My father's hand was still resting on the phone receiver. He hadn't moved it. His knuckles were white. Behind him, through the office window, the equipment yard sat in the pale morning light. The gravel, the oil stains, the fence, and nothing else. The equipment yard at 7 a.m. Monday was the quietest it had been in 14 years. Even the fluorescent light seemed to dim, as though the building itself understood that the current running through it had changed. I turned toward the door. Behind me, I heard my mother's chair push back from the desk, the casters rolling on the plastic mat, a sound I had heard 10,000 times. She didn't stand. She just pushed back, as though the paper on her desk was something she needed distance from. My father said my name once more. "Joel." But it came out without any weight behind it. A reflex, like dialing the disconnected number. I walked through the door and into the parking lot, and the cold air hit my face, and I kept walking. I walked out of that office and drove to the leased lot in Warminster, where my trucks under my name, bearing my company's decals that the sign shop had applied over the weekend, sat in rows. 26 crew members were already there, loading equipment, checking routes, starting a workday that looked exactly like every other workday, except that the name on the checks had changed. One of my foremen, a man named Carlos, who'd been with me for 11 years, shook my hand and said, "About time, boss." He didn't say it with surprise. He said it with the tone of a man who had been waiting. Angela was beside her truck, clipboard in hand, and she nodded at me. Just a nod. Nothing more. But her eyes were wet. I sat in my truck in that lot for 4 minutes before I started the engine. I want you to understand what those 4 minutes felt like, because they were the point of everything. The cab smelled like coffee and cut grass, the same smell as every morning for 14 years. The steering wheel was cold under my hands. The vinyl seat cracked slightly as I shifted my weight. The same crack, the same sound, but in a truck that now bore a different name on its door. Through the Ponce Island, through the windshield, I could see the crews moving, the trucks warming up, the ordinary machinery of a business starting its day. Exhaust rose from the tailpipes in thin white columns, catching the early light before dissolving. But the knot that had lived between my shoulder blades since I was 26 years old, the one Danielle pressed her hand against every Sunday night, the one that tightened every time I pulled into my parents' yard, that knot released. Not all at once, in waves, like a fist unclenching finger by finger. I felt my shoulders drop 2 inches. I felt my jaw unclamp. I felt the muscles along my neck soften for the first time in so long that the sensation was foreign, almost alarming. I felt the specific physical sensation of a body that had been braced for impact for 14 years, slowly, incredulously, believing that the impact was not coming. I sat in that truck, and I cried. Not dramatically, not with sound, just water running from my eyes down my face while I stared at a fleet of trucks with my name on them and understood in my body, rather than my mind, that I was free. That the building I had constructed inside their building was now standing on its own foundation, and no one could take it, because every piece of paper, every bond, every license, every client signature, every lease agreement was mine. Legally, operationally, irreversibly mine. If you're listening to this and your hands shake on Sunday nights, if you built something that someone else's name is on, stay with me. This part is for you. The feeling of that silence, that first moment, when the threat is not behind you, but simply gone, when the air in your lungs goes all the way down for the first time in years. I can't give you that feeling, but I can tell you it exists. And I can tell you that every logistical step, every terrifying, almost caught moment, every night of lying awake, running the sequence, it purchases this silence, this breath. The calls started at 8:47 a.m. My mother first. I didn't answer. My father at 9:12. I didn't answer. Kevin at 9:30. Short. Confused. Joel, what's going on? Mom's freaking out. I didn't answer. By noon, I had 14 missed calls. By 3 p.m., 23. The voicemails progressed like weather changing. My mother at 9 a.m. Casual concern. Joel, call me when you get a chance. We need to talk about this morning. My mother at 10:30. Sharper. I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is not how family operates. My father at 11. The business voice. Controlled, negotiating. Son, let's sit down and work this out. Nobody needs to get lawyers involved. My mother at 1 p.m. The first crack, the voice pitching higher. Joel, the clients are calling and nobody's here. What did you do? My father at 3. Anger now. The pretense gone. You're going to regret this. Everything you have came from us. Everything I had came from me. The clients I built, the crews I trained, the routes I designed, The reputation I maintained at 3 a.m. in ice storms while they slept in a house paid for by my labor. But I didn't say that. I didn't say anything. I let the voicemails accumulate like evidence of a power structure collapsing in real time. Each notification lit up my phone screen, and I watched the name flash. Mom, Dad, Kevin, Mom, Dad, Mom. And I let each one go dark. By evening, the intervals between calls had grown longer. The messages had grown shorter. The last voicemail from my mother that day, at 6:42 p.m., was 9 seconds of silence, followed by the sound of her hanging up. She had run out of words. The silence she left on my voicemail was the same silence I had lived inside for 14 years. Now it was hers. Tuesday morning. The 11 commercial clients my parents thought they owned received nothing. No crews arrived. No trucks pulled in. No mowers started. Because the crews, the trucks, and the route maps had left with me 90 days earlier. They just hadn't known it yet. My parents arrived at the equipment yard and found it as I'd left it. A building. 2 old riding mowers from the original fleet that predated my tenure. And silence. The building's fluorescent lights hummed over empty bays. The pegboard on the wall still held the hooks where we'd hung the truck keys, all Kampakropausen. Solverosen 11 hooks, all empty. The whiteboard still displayed the weekly route schedule in my handwriting. Routes that were now running under a different name. The commercial broker Aunt Diane had connected them with. Ran the numbers on what remained. The valuation came back at $41,000. Their $1.4 million business was worth a building and 2 machines. Everything else, everything that generated revenue, maintained clients, and employed workers, was standing in a lot in Warminster, under my name. Kevin called me that Tuesday evening. Not angry, scared. His voice had the thin quality of a man doing math he doesn't want to finish. Joel, Mom says you stole the business. I didn't engage. I said, Kevin, I didn't steal anything. I filed paperwork for a new company, and the clients and crews chose to come with me. That's not theft. That's the market. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear him breathing. Then, did you know about the sale? I said, yes. He said, how? I said, Rachel. The line went silent for 12 seconds. 12 seconds where Kevin's marriage and his understanding of his family rearranged themselves in real time. I let those seconds exist. I did not fill them. I did not explain. Some silences are not yours to break. My parents attempted the narrative. Of course they did. By Wednesday, my mother had called Aunt Diane, Uncle Phil, 3 of my cousins, and 2 people from church. The story she told was that I had gone behind their backs, that I was ungrateful, that they had given me everything, and this is how he repays us. The narrative encountered the truth at every turn. Aunt Diane, who had provided the broker contact for the sale, a sale that cut me out entirely, could not credibly position herself as a victim. Uncle Phil, who'd watched me work holidays for 14 years while Kevin came and went, said to my mother, Linda, what did you expect? The church friends who called me didn't call to scold. They called to say they weren't surprised. One of them, a woman named Marjorie who'd taught my Sunday school class 30 years ago, said, your mother told everyone you didn't have the spine. I told her she was wrong. I thanked her and hung up and sat with that for a while. My father drove to my duplex on Thursday. Danielle saw him through the window and called me. I told her not to answer the door. He sat in his car in my driveway for 45 minutes. I know because Danielle timed it. 45 minutes of a man who once told me I didn't have the spine, sitting in a driveway, engine running, hands on the wheel, unable to reach the son he'd underestimated for 14 years. The exhaust curled up from his Tahoe in the cold March air. Danielle watched from the upstairs window and described it to me on the phone. how he sat perfectly still, how he looked at the front door without moving, how he finally put the car in reverse and backed out slowly, like a man leaving a place he knew he would not return to. He left a note on my door. "We need to talk. This isn't over." It was over. He just hadn't accepted the paperwork yet. The legal aftermath was brief, because I'd built the infrastructure to make it brief. My parents' attorney, once they reached the new number 3 days later, reviewed the situation and reportedly told them they had limited recourse. I hadn't breached a non-compete because the Huurstaal der... No. None. I hadn't stolen trade secrets because the routes, relationships, and operational knowledge were mine. I was the trade secret. I hadn't violated any employment agreement because I'd never had one. 14 years of handshake promises meant 14 years of no contractual obligations. The very informality they'd used to keep me dependent was the same informality that set me free. The attorney's bill for that consultation was $1,800. It was the last professional service Costello Commercial Landscaping LLC would ever purchase. Rachel. She resigned from Costello Commercial the same week. Kevin didn't understand why until he checked the filing cabinet and found that the tax records had been photographed. She didn't come to work for me. She went back to school, nursing program at Bucks County Community College. The last time I saw her, she was in the parking lot of the campus with a backpack over one shoulder, and she looked like someone who had stepped out of a room she'd been locked in, without knowing the door was open. I recognized the look. It was the same one I saw in my mirror every morning for the Roman. First month, she raised her hand, not a wave, just an open palm held up for a moment, and I raised mine back. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The first weeks were not celebration. They were recalibration. I had spent 14 years performing a role, the loyal son, the reliable operator, the man who stayed despite everything, and shedding that role was like removing a cast from a limb that had been broken and set wrong. The bone had to relearn its true shape. I caught myself asking Danielle for permission to spend money from my own account. I caught myself flinching when my phone rang, expecting demands. I caught myself driving past my parents' property out of habit, the way you'd touch a bruise to check if it still hurts. The third time I did it, Danielle was in the passenger seat. She didn't say anything. She just reached over and put her hand on the back of my neck, the way she used to press my hands flat on Sunday nights. I turned the truck around and drove home a different way. I haven't driven past that property since, but there were mornings, specific mornings that mattered. The first time I drove to the Warminster lot and saw my name on the sign. Not my family's name, my name. Painted in dark green on white, bolted to the fence, lit by the early sun at an angle that made the letters glow. I sat in the lot with the engine idling and felt it in my chest as a physical warmth, like standing in sunlight after a long time indoors. The first time I wrote a check to a crew member from an account that bore my signature alone. The first time a client called me directly, heard Joel Costello Landscape in my voice, and said, "Glad you finally did it, Joel." They knew. More of them knew than I'd realized. The clients had seen the architecture of the trap from the outside. They'd noticed my parents never visiting properties, never attending to emergencies, never showing up when it mattered. They'd been waiting for me to see what they could see. 3 months after the exit, the business grossed more in a single month than any month under my parents' name. The overhead was lower because I wasn't paying two people $190,000 each to play owner. The crews were more productive because the organizational structure matched the operational reality. The person making decisions was the person with the knowledge. I raised everyone's pay. Not dramatically, enough to matter. Enough that Carlos said, "Boss, my wife noticed. Angela told me she'd put her daughter in swim lessons with the difference. Small numbers, real lives. My parents' response settled into a pattern. My mother cycled between fury and grief, calling every 2 weeks to leave voicemails that alternated between accusation and appeal. My father went quiet, the more dangerous response, I thought. But it turned out to be resignation. Kevin's CrossFit gym, funded by the money they'd planned to extract from selling my work, was struggling. The second location never opened. The $140,000 they'd given him was gone. The $41,000 from the remaining Costello commercial assets covered their debts and not much else. The retirement they'd built on the assumption that my labor would always be available, that I would always be there, always grateful, always spineless. Sure, hire Paula. Dissolved like a handshake in the rain. I don't tell you this with satisfaction. I tell you this with the flat, specific honesty of a man who knows what it cost. I lost my parents. Not to death, to truth. The relationship that exists now is a voicemail. I decline on Wednesday evenings while my daughter asks me to read. Chapter 6. It is a distance measured not in miles, but in the recognition that the people who were supposed to protect your future were actively consuming it. A Tuesday evening in May, I'm sitting on the back step of my duplex. The concrete is warm from the afternoon sun, and I can feel the heat of it through my jeans. My daughter is drawing with chalk on the patio, blue and yellow lines that curve and intersect in patterns only she understands. Danielle is inside, and I can hear her laughing at something on her phone. The evening air has that specific Bucks County quality, honeysuckle and cut grass and the distant hum of the turnpike. On the step beside me, in a small cardboard box, is the carabiner. I took it off my mother's desk the day I went back to collect my personal items from the office. I don't know why I took it. It doesn't open anything anymore. The key that was clipped to it is in an envelope on a locked gate at a property that is no longer my concern. But the carabiner itself, scratched silver, 16 years of my pocket, wearing the finish. I keep it, not as a trophy, as a unit of measurement, the weight of everything I carried that was never mine. I used to think loyalty meant staying. I was wrong. Loyalty means building, and building means the thing you build should bear your name, or you have to ask yourself who you're really building for. I used to think family and business could share the same handshake. They can. But only if both hands are honest. If you built something with your hands and watched someone else's name stay on it for years, and you're still there, I'm not telling you to leave. I'm telling you that the math doesn't fix itself. Count what they promised. Count what they delivered. If those numbers don't match, you already know. My daughter looks up from her chalk drawing and says, "Dad, look." She's drawn a house. It has a door with a handle and 4 windows, and a triangle roof, and a sun in the corner. "Is it our house?" I ask. "It's your house," she says, with the absolute certainty of a child who doesn't yet know that those words could make a grown man's eyes fill. I look at the chalk house on the concrete. It's a house with a door only we can open. That's the story of Joel Costello. One carabiner carried for 16 years and returned without a note. One voicemail, forwarded to the wrong chat that broke the last handshake. And one Monday morning in March where the quietest equipment yard in Bucks County became the loudest thing a family had ever heard. If you've ever looked at what you built and wondered whose name should really be on it, tell me in the comments.